For governor of Minnesota, Republican Jeff Johnson was the GOP nominee for governor back in 2014, but he lost to incumbent Governor Dayton. Now, Johnson, a Hennepin County commissioner, is making a second run for the office, and Jeff Johnson joining us in studio today. Thanks for being here, Commissioner.
Yeah, thank you, Tom.
You ran for governor, as we just mentioned, in 2014 against an incumbent governor. You lost by about 5 points, about 110,000 votes. Obviously a much different race now that there is no incumbent. How is this race different, and how is your candidacy likely to be different?
Well, you learn a lot once you run statewide, whether you win or lose. And the biggest difference, obviously, it's an open seat, and there's not a long-time governor in place right there. So we see that from the national organizations, almost all of whom are rating this as a toss-up race. That's a big difference. But, you know, the landscape has changed over the last few years, particularly after 2016. And I think that, you know, whether you love Donald Trump or hate Donald Trump, I think he's changed the way at least some people in Minnesota think about politics and what they expect. And I think I have learned as I've been traveling around the state that people are looking for somebody who's pretty out front, who's not poll testing their message, but just saying, here's what I think, here's why I think it. Maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't, but you know, we're not going to dance around issues anymore.
We'll talk more about the potential Trump effect a bit later, but before you get a chance to run in a general election, you have to get the Republican nomination first. I know you're seeking the endorsement of the party, but there's likely to be a primary involving at least former Governor Tim Pawlenty and maybe Mary Giuliani Stevens, depending upon how this race shakes out. We know Keith Downey dropped out this week. What do you have to do to differentiate yourself from the former governor and from Mary Giuliani Stevens? Well,
as you mentioned, there are really two steps before we get to the general. One is the endorsement in a couple months, and both Mary and I have said that we'll abide by that endorsement. So if someone else is endorsed, I'm there, she's there. Tim is going to go to a primary regardless. I feel really good about that endorsement, but I got to keep my head down and make sure I get it. That makes a huge difference in a low turnout primary, which Minnesota has because it's in the middle of August. In that primary, distinguishing myself from Tim, I don't think is going to be that difficult. I mean, we are just very different candidates. And, you know, I talk a lot as I travel around the state about where I see the future going, and I'm getting a lot of positive feedback on that. Tim will talk about that as well. But fair or not, this will be a referendum on his past, whether it's the lobbying, whether it's his 8 years as governor, whether it is, you know, where he's been at in Trump, kind of up and down. And I think it's going to be really hard to win if this whole campaign is a debate about the past.
Now, Tim Pawlenty said the reason he decided to run was because none of the other Republican candidates were, in his words, getting traction in this race. How do you view that statement?
Well, I disagree with it, obviously. I mean, if I didn't feel like I was getting traction, I wouldn't be in the race. And I'm hearing him say right now he's not sure if he will go for the endorsement because it seems like maybe the cake is already baked, as he said, which would suggest that he thinks somebody is already getting a lot of traction, and I feel like I am. If you look at the caucus straw polls, if you look at the straw poll just from CD3 last weekend, I'm in really good shape with the base of the party, every faction of that base. And by the way, I think that's another distinction. We can't win as Republicans in November unless we have a very united, enthused base, whether it's our business Republicans or our social Republicans or the new Trump voters or the Libertarian wing. I've been able to unite all those factions, and Tim won't be able to do that.
Now, if you do get the Republican nomination, obviously in this general election you would not be running against an incumbent. You'd be running, though, against one of potentially a few Democrats who do have long public records that you would be able to go after, just like they would be able to go after your record. How are you going to differentiate your Republican values from their Democrat Party values?
Well, you know, the overriding issue that I've been talking about throughout the last year of this campaign has been changing the culture and the attitude that we see in state government, especially in our state agencies. So if you look at the DNR or the MPCA or the Department of Education, and I could go right on down the list, we are seeing not just great examples of incompetence that we're not really dealing with very well, but you're seeing an attitude where many, not all, but many in government seem to believe their job is to tell everyone else how to live their lives as opposed to serving. And my goal, and I think that is easy, very easy to set apart from any of the DFLers in this race, my goal is going to be to change that culture just fundamentally change the culture in government and our state agencies to that of serving people. And that, I think, is the only way long-term we're going to be able to get a hold of some of the bigger issues we have, like overregulation and overtaxation and lack of health insurance options, right on down the list.
In that 2014 race, you had promised if you were elected you would try to repeal those income taxes on the upper-income Minnesotans that Governor Dayton successfully pushed for back in 2012. Would that still be a goal of yours?
Absolutely. And, you know, we are in the top, I believe, 8 in almost every single tax category in Minnesota. But the one that concerns me the most is the income tax. Our highest rate, I think, is 85% higher than the national average, which is bad because it drives out wealth and investment. My bigger problem, though, is our lowest rate. Our lowest income tax rate in Minnesota is higher than the highest rate in 22 other states. So we're not just taxing to death the CEO in Minnesota. We're taxing to death the school teacher and the mechanic and the bartender. We need to fix that.
Now, Governor Dayton will defend those tax increases by saying they're largely responsible for the surpluses we've enjoyed recently.
Yeah, well, and I would disagree with that, because if you can go back in the history of the state, and we have periods of surpluses and projected deficits, and it sometimes moves up and down depending upon the national winds and how the economy is going. So, you know, him claiming that surpluses are simply the fact that they had the biggest tax increase we've ever seen, I think some of that is outside the governor's control. But I would add, having surpluses is not a sign of good government to me. Year after year after year, if you have huge surpluses, it means you're taking too much money from taxpayers.
Finally, getting back to President Trump, you did endorse him before the 2016 election. You said you had questions about his character, but on policy, you thought he was the best choice. Do you still feel that way, and would you welcome him to Minnesota to campaign on your behalf if you're in the general election?
Absolutely. I support the president, and, you know, our styles differ. I'm a Norwegian Lutheran from northern Minnesota, and he is not. But I absolutely support the direction he's trying to take the country, and if he's willing to come here to campaign, I will have him, absolutely.
Despite what you considered his character flaws before the election, and I don't know if that's changed at all since then?
Yeah. I mean, we are very different people, and you know, I'm not going to pretend that that he and I are alike. We're not, but I would love to have him here, absolutely.
All right, Jeff Johnson, Republican candidate for governor in Minnesota here in 2018. Best of luck to you.
Thank you.
On the campaign trail. I'm sure we'll see you again soon. We will be interviewing all of the major candidates for governor, Republicans and Democrats, between now and the middle of May. Up next, Brian McDaniel and Darren Broughton join me for political analysis. We'll be back in 2 minutes.